Okay, so call this library as a liminal space, the space in between things, and I want to explore that sense of what it is that we say when we say the word library. As Mark mentioned, I'm a technology journalist, I'm a hack and pundit. I'm also what I like to think of as a recovering programmer. Being a programmer is like being an alcoholic. You never actually stop, you just have periods of some months in which you don't actually hack your WordPress site or edit any PHP or think, oh, that C code looks particularly lovely and delicious today. So I do occasionally fall off the wagon, but I honestly haven't done anything more hard than CSS for months now. And I want to begin with a preamble. The cat is alive. The cat is also dead. Because this is a time of what you might call the superposition of wave states, because tomorrow, many of us vote, some of us, like me, may already have voted, in what I think is the most important UK general election since 1945. And when that happens, the act of observation will be important. Because we won't know if the cat is alive or dead until many, many boxes are opened. Boxes like this one. This was the first secret ballot in the United Kingdom, taken from Wikimedia Commons, hence the attribution. Library conference, have to be attribution, otherwise you're in real trouble. All those photos that don't have attribution were taken by me personally. We don't know which world awaits us tomorrow. And I'm not going to be partisan, I work for the BBC. But my talk is written in the light of a possible future for your libraries and for the idea of a library that's predicated on Enlightenment values, on scholarship, on humanism, on humanity, an open, liberal, inclusive society that values every citizen and appreciates that we're all connected and interdependent, which embraces diversity and differences of all types, including philosophy and indeed business model, and which is confident in itself. Society confident enough to be able to address the major challenges that face us, both from the biosphere as weather systems change, and that face our species as the food web comes close to collapse. Now, each of you will have your own view on how that society could be achieved. I couldn't possibly comment. Instead, I want to talk about libraries. I want to talk about the Liminal Library. This is the State Library in Dresden, where I was a couple of years ago for a conference. It's one of my favorites. There are several photographs of libraries in this talk. A library is a strange thing. It is not just a space. A library exists on that numinous boundary between the atom and the bit, between the bit and the thought, and between the thought and the atom. That constructed reality we all inhabit every day without thinking about it. That world that lives inside our heads but is based around our interactions with each other, with atoms, with information. It's more than just a space, it's more than just access to information. A library, particularly a university or an academic library, is a zone of engagement. It is, to some extent, where the academy meets itself almost in public. And the issues that face libraries are not just about funding models or staff skills and roles or about bureaucracy and administrative overload or open access or journals or books or e-books or metadata standards. All of those things matter enormously, of course. And the decisions each of you makes every day and over the next few years will have real implications for the thing we call a library service. But there's something much more. And my reflections on it are derived from the fact that I come to you as an outsider. Right? I'm the entertainment. If you're fortunate, I'm the reward at the end of 2 long, hard days of engagement, at a point where you're all about to head home, where you're all about to relax a bit. So I am not going to talk in detail about ways in which libraries could more effectively share their low and no use subscriptions via document delivery, or the notion of pre-press as a viable way forward for disseminating researchers' findings, or the opportunities for libraries to enhance repository search, or the need for you to up your game for students as the TEF comes along, and for researchers with REF 2021 on the horizon. All suggestions which came in from my library contacts when they knew I was giving this talk. All things people wanted on your agenda. Instead, I want to look at the broader picture as someone who is a long-term user of all of your libraries, and as someone who, as I was once described, comes from the internet. In actual fact, I don't come from the internet, I come from somewhere a bit closer than that, namely here. I'm a Geordie. I was born across the river that flows outside this very conference room in Newcastle. I lived in Jarrow until I was 5. My mum was from Hebburn, the posh bit. My dad was from Jarrow, the less posh bit. He worked in the metal industries. He then became a lift engineer and took the family south in 1965 when I was 4 years old, hence the lack of an identifiable Geordie accent. None of you picked up on the fact I was a Geordie until I told you. In the Midlands, I found a library. Literally found a library. I wrote about it for a book that was published by Blast Theory earlier this year called A Place Free of Judgment. Corby's an interesting town. It used to be a steel town until they closed the steelworks, or most of it, in 1980. And Corby was a new town. It was a medieval village with steel and coal. In the 1950s, they built the new town. This was the town centre that they built when I was 16 and demolished when I was 54. So I lived through Queen Square. And what I wrote was this. I said, I grew up in a town called Corby in Northampton in the 1960s in a council house on a rough estate. Corby Library was my gateway to a world that I could not have imagined otherwise, a space where I was both safe and nurtured, where the librarians encouraged my exploration and imagination and pointed out a path that I would never have discovered otherwise. I read the books, all of the books. When I discovered the science fiction section, I discovered a multitude of universes to explore. But I also remember being allowed to borrow The Godfather by Mario Puzo before I was old enough to see the film, and realizing that a whole world lay before me. But there was more, because at the back of the reference section of the library was a secret portal, a door. And in that door, through that door, was the library of the technical college next door. And I remember passing through it for the first time. I was probably about 11 years old, and discovering the engineering and science books it contained, the world it hinted at. And it was amazing, and it was always a special treat to sneak in, because we probably weren't supposed to be in there, and get away with looking at some of those books. Looking back, I realized that one of the reasons why I believed enough in myself to apply and successfully get to university, and I was the only one in my sixth form at the local comprehensive to do that in the year I left, was because the library was my runway. And I built up enough momentum in there to become airborne. Now, I left Corby, went to university. I did not go back to live. By the time I could have gone back to live, there wasn't much to go back to, although I do go back to visit, and the people of Corby are strong and resilient, and you can read online what I think of the people who tore my town down, but I'm not going to repeat it here. Google Bill Thompson, Corby. The town is coming back, good people are trying to work with it. And that technical college library was the first academic library I'd ever encountered. Since then, there've been many, because the place I went to from Corby was St Catherine's College, Cambridge. So, you know, bigger library, more libraries, many libraries. And I was a philosophy undergraduate. I did philosophy and psychology, so I was basically unemployable when I graduated, which was the reason I became a computer programmer, of course. And when I was a young undergraduate, I'd sit in the philosophy library, some of you may know it, up on the Sidgwick site, and read papers in mind that really challenged my sense of self. And I was writing essays about the nature of truth. Are there synthetic a priori truths? Is the fact that the morning star is the evening star, which is always true, nonetheless a synthetic truth because it was a discovery? Later in the bar, anyone who wants, I'll take you on that one. And when I did this, I would look at the librarians happily filling out index cards and putting books on shelves and smiling at their colleagues, and I really wanted to swap places. I mean, it just looked like such a fantastic job, much, much better than sweating my way with a fountain pen over 50-year-old essays and trying to understand what Wittgenstein was up to, more of him later. I didn't actually know much, as you can tell, about the reality of life as an academic librarian, but later I went out with one. In fact, she worked in that same library. And since then, I've had many friends on the inside, so now I know a little bit more about the profession. I remain surprised, therefore, that there isn't the equivalent of Inspector Morse or Midsummer Murders set in a university library, with the corpses piling up each week, being hidden in the stacks. Because you all seem to get on so well, but I've been told stories. Now, the world's changed enormously since 1980 and my dreams of librarianship. I typed my essays and had never used a computer. The first computer I did use was in my third year as part of the experimental psychology module. It was an Acorn Atom, the precursor of the BBC microcomputer, up on the top floor of the experimental psychology lab at Cambridge. If any of you have ever seen the film 28 Days Later, that's where it starts, on the top floor of the experimental psychology lab in Cambridge with the rabid monkeys, okay? Well, they weren't actually rabid monkeys, but there were monkeys up there. The modern world is somewhat different. This is the Wi-Fi password for an Elizabethan manor house in Norfolk, where some of my friends and I were staying last year. Because you couldn't possibly go to an Elizabethan manor house in Norfolk and not have decent Wi-Fi, could you? I mean, break all the rules. We live in a society that is dependent on, that is completely dependent on access to and engagement with computers and digital data and fast networks. We're as dependent on it as we are on electricity or oil, used to be on coal. We seem to be weaning ourselves off that one. And in this age of electronics, the patterns of my daily life are increasingly defined by the capabilities of the tools I engage with. So I find myself reliant on internet access, on the capabilities of the handheld network supercomputer, or phone, that we all carry with us as I negotiate between home and work and family and friends and my engagement with culture and learning at all levels. Not only that, most of my media consumption these days also relies on IP, on the internet protocol, instead of broadcasting. The Freeview tuner in our television at home stopped working 3 years ago. We have not got round to fixing it. Because everything you might want to watch is available through some streaming service, now increasingly legitimate, that you can therefore get your hands on. And the stuff that you can't, well, you find you don't actually miss very much at all. By the way, this is a metaphor for research access to printed papers, but let's not go there. The nature of the research that is supported in academic libraries has also, of course, changed completely in that time. Books and printed journals matter less, or rather people believe they matter less. Catalogues and data sets and screen-based resources seem to matter more. And machine learning is rushing in to this space. Learning augments research skills, and if you look at the latest add-in, something called Google Explore in Sheets, it will even draw your graphs for you based on natural language interface. If you tell it to graph something, it will do that. They've literally just announced this as an extension. It's the first serious application of a machine learning system into what is basically consumer tech that I've seen that's made me go, whoa, this is now getting interesting. Because Siri and the voice-activated systems, they have their uses, and they're going to become really, really important. But this is something I can see a lot of people getting very interested in over time. So it's worth looking at what they're doing. And there's a problem. The problem is it's not stopping. This is a photograph I took in an antique shop in Chongqing in China a couple of years ago, where they are selling 2 antique mobile phones. Because those things are now primitive technology, therefore worth preserving. In this rapidly shifting technological landscape, you see, we're seeing new forms emerging from the old. Just as the technology, the actual hardware develops, so the capabilities of the software that it runs and the systems it is embedded with shift as well. And these new forms graft digital characteristics like, say, immediate feedback and direct engagement onto what were formerly static forms, static analog offerings. The nature of the monograph, the book, the research paper shifts because of that interaction. And we see what's happened with the social media explosion, but the social research explosion is just as significant, the impact of tools like Mendeley and Zotero. These reshape our assumptions about what happens in the library about what academics do when they publish, about what researchers do when they research. These words start to become contested spaces, start to become things that we need to think about, whereas previously we thought we had a shared understanding. And this is not the much vaunted convergence that tech pundits like me occasionally find ourselves talking about when we can't think of anything else to say to fill the airwaves. Because let me reveal to you, the secret of being a good technology journalist is not to be clever, it's to be not stupid. As long as you don't say anything that is actually wrong or foolish, they will probably invite you back again. And if you can do 16 years of never having said something too foolish, you become, a respected figure. You only need to be very occasionally clever or insightful, but you must never be wrong. Okay? Yeah, that's the trick. That's the only trick of being on the BBC. This is not convergence. If you understand convergence as the coming together of all the different forms of content and creative expression into a bucket of bits that can be delivered over the network to any screen or device, that's not what is happening. Instead, we're seeing new forms of media life evolve, each specialized to survive in a particular niche, all competing for attention in a world that can seem saturated with stuff demanding to be watched, listened to, discussed, reviewed, analyzed, taken down, criticized. And all of that is happening in the midst of rapid environmental change, where those forms of life that evolve find that the ecosystem they've adapted to, the niche they thought they occupied, disappears really rather quickly. So we've got rapid change. We're in that stage of punctuated evolution where things are going fast, the Cambrian explosion of media forms and research forms. And we've got massive shifts in the environment, which has not yet stabilized. So it's no wonder we can't keep track of it. The shiny new thing of today is the redundant technology of tomorrow, or maybe yesterday. And only some of these things will flourish over time. We're at a stage of change, in a period of discovery and experimentation that is at least as exciting as the early years of the Gutenberg press, and possibly as exciting as the development of alphabets in the first place. Maybe this is a once in 5,000 year stage of innovation in the way the human species manages to share and communicate with each other. If we have, as Thorsten was talking earlier, at the British Library, the idea that, well, maybe we at the BL should be thinking about the machines as our customers and not the actual human readers. Maybe it's our APIs that really matter. I think we're on the verge of some significant transformations. And if you're trying to do this, you have a problem because you can't tell in advance which innovations are going to succeed, what this will mean for established forms of engagement, wither the book, will the book wither. And that's a real challenge for anyone engaged in building tomorrow's libraries, which is what we're talking about. What use is your digital strategy when everything you think is necessary for your users could be superseded by something that is currently in the labs or is just about to be invented by someone in a garage? How do you decide what to collect, how to index it, how to make it discoverable, and crucially, how much to pay for that in order to give your research community access to it, when you don't know if it's going to be there or useful or superseded within 6 months, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? I know I'm not making it sound easy. Well, that's because it isn't easy. One way to express this, let's go back to Cambridge. This is the Moore Library. Not far from there is St. Giles graveyard where Wittgenstein is buried. And I'm one of those people, an old-time Wittgensteinian. Was introduced to the philosophical investigations while I was an undergraduate, never got over it. So I'd like to pose the issue in this way. Does the thing we say when we say the word library mean the same as it did 1 or 10 or 100 years ago? Or are we in fact using it in a different language game? Not in the sense that a word can find its meaning has changed, like gay or digital or even computer. Remember, computers used to be the people who actually did the calculations. But in Wittgenstein's sense of the role the word plays in the life of a community of users. So, what do we say when we say library? Not what do we mean by the word library, but what are we actually saying? What are we communicating within the community of users? and I mean the community of users quite broadly construed, to include host universities, funders, government, researchers, academics, students, all those who you engage with, in order to maintain this service that we call the library service. And that takes us to a bigger question. If the meaning of a word is its pattern of use, how do we use the word library? What is it that a library does? What is the only thing that a library does? What is it that only a library does? And this is a question that is often asked internally about the BBC. The BBC is a peculiar institution, 95 years old, funded through a levy, the television license, in order to provide a space between politics and commerce within which the public value of communications media can be best delivered to everyone, the best of everything for everyone. The BBC is not supposed to interfere in the market, and therefore often a question is asked, is this something that only the BBC can do? Not whether the BBC is the only place to do it, but are we the only people who can do it? And it's quite a useful corrective, because it pulls you back from trying to be everything to everyone and focuses you on the core mission. So should libraries try more clearly to understand what it is that only they do as the world shifts and science becomes driven by the capabilities of technology and literary research relies more on Google Scholar and Mendelean Zotero than the close reading of a text, and augmented realities and augmented intelligence start to replace some of the traditional tools and services that we can ask? What is the role of a library when someone who is running a research program can have an augmented intelligence instead of a research assistant, and the augmented intelligence doesn't ask for credit on a paper or preferment in the department? How does that start to shift things? And I think it goes back to my point about the library as liminal, as between things, as being on the threshold. Being on the threshold between different forms of captured knowledge. This is a photograph I took a couple of weeks ago in Venice, and it's the wall of the Arsenale. So you've got the canal there and the Arsenale wall. Venice exists, Venice sits between the sea and the sky, between the water and the air. It is, if any city is a city, a threshold city. It will eventually be overwhelmed. A library has always offered access to what I see as the private space of the mind. Again, back to Wittgenstein. And you can see it often, the way that readers in libraries will lose their sense of where they are as they become lost in the book, as they are entirely absorbed and no longer present in any space other than the space in their head where new knowledge is being assimilated or accommodated, where they are changing themselves by that process of engagement with the material captured in the library. Today, of course, readers, users of libraries, demand to have access to another shared space, not the shared space of the text, but the shared space of the network. And providing access to that is a bit more complicated. It's not enough to just have seats and lights and desks. You need all the paraphernalia of internet access, of screens and computers and networks and power and all those things. But nonetheless, it remains important and is something that libraries provide. And it's a very important space. We made this space. We constructed this space painfully over the past 40 or 50 years. We conjured this network out of our desires. It was coded, it was built into hardware, its characteristics were defined by people like Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn. It was programmed. People like Wendy Hall at Southampton helped us to understand it. And it is a gateway. It is a space within which many things can be accessed through the screen. Libraries, therefore, have a role now to be not just a gateway to the world inside one's head, but a gateway to that shared space of engagement which exists on the other side of the screen, where we not just meet other people, we can talk to them. When you read a novel, the characters are entirely animated by you. The voices in your head are all yours. Jane Eyre is only your imagination, taking the words on the page to spark them. When you put your head inside the screen, the voices in your head are the voices of other people. It's different. It is a different and shared space. But this is not to say that the library becomes of less value because it is that gateway. We are used to being able to access the network from almost anywhere. I took this photograph of a woman who was desperately trying to get online from an airport, charging her phone, needing to be somewhere else, both physically, she was at an airport, but also emotionally and psychologically. She was putting her head inside the screen. A library is a space where that can be done, but it has its own history as a space where we engage both with each other and with the assets which are stored and retained there. And each individual library has the unique quality of being the only place that is the place it is. It's like Walter Benjamin said about the meaning of art in an age of mechanical reproduction. Each individual work of art, each individual book is the only thing that is the thing it is, and that gives it incredible special nature. So even if a room in your library, even if a desk in that library is a gateway to an infinitely replicable virtual space, the combination of physical and virtual space is as unique as the physical space, and it has to allow for that local reality to intrude. And that matters, because libraries are unique and special. This is the State Library of Victoria, this is Birmingham Library, this is Canada Water Library, three of my favourites. When we go into that library space, we bring the world in our head into contact with the world as mediated by the library, and we do it in a distinct physical space, in an environment which overlaps and intersects with virtual spaces. And all of those combinations have never existed before. And we need to appreciate its uniqueness as well as the commonalities. The point about readers having digital skills, about knowing how to research, how to use collections, is so they can navigate those spaces relatively comfortably, so they can do it with ease, so they can get into a state of flow with the collections. The barriers to access that exist, the difficulties that emerge when you're trying to access, say, specific papers because they're behind paywalls, or because the authentication is very good, or because they haven't been collected, all intrude on the emerging reality of the researcher or the student, the user, the individual, engaging with the collection of knowledge materials that are collected and made available to them in the library. And we want to encourage that to happen in what I would call this post-revolutionary world. Because the fact is that the digital revolution happened 10 years ago, and we're just trying to cope with it. That the real changes happened a long time back. Let's not forget that this, the original iPhone, is now 10 years old. We have had a decade of that. We should not be talking about the revolution as if it's coming. We should be talking about it in the past, and we're living with the consequences. And the consequences for libraries are felt in the sets of assumptions that readers and users and funders make, the things that you're required to bring to the table, the things that you're required to offer, and also, though crucially, the lack of certainty that I referred to earlier. Because it may have been 10 years since the revolution, but we have not yet built a stable new world order on top of that. And things continue to come down the line, which require us to rethink even that modest set of assumptions that support our activities day to day. Like this one. Have any of you here used a Microsoft HoloLens? Any? Okay. I thoroughly recommend it. So this was me at a demo a few weeks ago. So you put on this headset, the computer is in the band around your head, so it's entirely untethered, and you've got basically sort of screen in front of you that you look through, and onto that is projected in stereoscopically an illusion of a world. So I could look out of this room and see a globe floating in free space. And if I reach up to it, I can grab hold of it. I do that, I do a tap to hold it, and then I can move it around. And the computer knows where all the objects are in the room because it's sending out infrared. It knows where my hand is, so it will track it. If I move that globe down, when it reaches the table, it will stop. And I can rest it on the table. And if I then move around, it will move in stereo, and it will occlude those things which are behind it, and it will be occluded by the things which are in front of it. It's a remarkable thing. It's still a little bit clunky, but it's not going to be clunky for long. So what happens when every user comes into the library with the equivalent of a Microsoft HoloLens and a library bot to help them navigate the collections, whether they are real or virtual? What happens when I can walk along the shelves and the books that are not in the library are inserted back on the shelves so I can read virtual copies of them? What happens when research papers can appear on the desk next to the physical papers, where the PDF is just projected so I can act as if my desk is the space and I cannot tell the difference between the physical and the virtual? And I have a little augmented assistant that will go and do the research for me. This technology is coming quite fast. I think it will first arrive in museums and galleries, because I'm of an age now, as you can tell, where I can't read the labels on walls, and I'm in danger of having a security guard hit me because I get too close to the Monet trying to figure out what exactly is going on there. So you can imagine a museum experience being massively enhanced by this, by systems which are in different languages, which are accessible. Perhaps you have an easy reading version and a more complex version. All of these become possible. And if that's the case, then I think we will see the technology head into the consumer layer, but also into our libraries really quite soon. These augmented reality technologies bring the museum or gallery or the library even further into that liminal zone. So, what are you going to do? This is the funniest thing I've seen on the internet for a very long time. Beckett and Father Ted. For those of you who do not get the joke, Samuel Beckett's waiting for Godot, Mrs. Doyle from Father Ted. Okay. So you've got to go on. You can't give up. You're not going to just all stay in Newcastle, fine city though it is, or even Gateshead, and just head to the bar afterwards and drink Newcastle Brown until you forget it all. Wake up on Friday morning and head off to the Bermudas or anywhere else. You're going to carry on. And I want you to do the thing you already do and do incredibly well. I want you to choose. Because that's what libraries do. That is the thing that libraries do, above all. Earlier this year, the National Archives announced a new strategy called Archives Unlocked. I don't know if you've seen it. And I was asked to consult on it because of the work I do at the BBC with the BBC Archives over the years, particularly on developing partnerships. And they also asked me to write one of the short pieces to accompany the actual document. And this is some of what I wrote. You can read the whole thing online. I said this: when the journalist Joan Didion wrote "We tell ourselves stories in order to live" in her book The White Album in 1979, again references, she was expressing a deep truth about how we construct meaning in our lives. Many of our stories come from those relics of the past that live in our archives, libraries, and galleries. Some are newly minted, others retell and reframe the past to better understand the present. But the archive, too, is a story. Whether creative fiction, careful scholarship, or news journalism, any exploration of an archive must grapple with the questions surrounding the collection itself. Why and how was this material preserved? Is this all? Or is there missing work that will change my perspective? How can this selection of past material have authority? Part of the BBC's archive, part of the BBC Archive's value is that it is the creation of one institution over a period of almost a century, giving it cohesiveness even in its incompleteness. There is an ideology that permeates it. Its contents were largely decided upon by the sort of people who worked for the BBC. And researchers and users should at least note this as they pass among the shelves and search the catalogues. And while perhaps not always so apparent, we know that every collection was shaped in some way, and the story of that shaping must be part of our understanding and assessment of the authority of the finished product. That was me thinking about archives, and the fact that archives are all necessarily incomplete. And I realized something while I was writing that, something I'd always known but never expressed, which is that an archive, however good, is in part an excuse for forgetting. An archive tries to forgive the things that were not collected, to excuse their absence by curating and explaining and offering a narrative that accounts for what is there, and by not properly explaining what is missing, helps erase it from immediate memory. If you go to the BBC Film Archive, you will find a lot of reels of film. If you open some of those cans, inside you'll find bits of programs, because some of those bits of programs were taken and used in other programs and never put back, in the days when film was actually physically transferred from one program to another. The archive is incomplete. An archive is therefore, in some sense, always an apology. It involves the sort of active forgetting that psychoanalysis is intended to expose, the constant expenditure of emotional energy in repressing the thing that must not only be forgotten, but can never be acknowledged to have been forgotten. It's what abreaction is for. A library is different. A library is an expressed choice. It is a selection from the world, a series of decisions made manifest in the collection and the data sets and the catalogue. A library does not make apologies for what is not there, it stands by what is. A couple of years ago, I went to hear Don Patterson read from his book, 40 Sonnets. I commend the book to you, it's an amazing book. And he was introduced by Matthew Hollis, Faber's poetry editor, who was his editor. And before Don spoke, Matthew talked a little bit about what it was like to receive the manuscript as it came in, to watch the poems as they were shaped. And he said something that has stuck with me ever since. He said, "These words were decided upon." And it's true, and it matters, and it is your role. You decide. You are here to decide not only what your libraries contain and what they offer, but in this time of enormous threat, to decide what we say when we say library. To decide that it means something chosen, in contrast to the great mass of everything on offer everywhere else. Because there's a real danger that library becomes, like the word digital, a word that conveys no meaning at all, that makes no distinction, that has neither intention nor extension, but is merely a grunt made by someone who does not appreciate how the world works. All of you here have the opportunity to define for yourselves a space where to talk of the library or the library service is to raise people's spirit, to give hope that someone somewhere will help, whether you're a struggling academic or a downhearted undergraduate or a doctoral student lost in the wild woods. So, the question is, can we capture the sense of the library and abstract from it something that will be worthy of the name in 10 or 20 or 50 years' time? Well, I've always said the best way to predict the future is to create it. It's not original, but it's true. So now is the chance to build a future you'd like to live in, not inherit one from people who don't understand the things we all value. It is time to be bold and fail, if you must fail, gloriously. Good luck. I fear you need it. Thank you.
We've got time for one or possibly two quick questions.
And I'm not running away afterwards if those of you aren't running away.
So anyone who's got a question, even comments, hand in the air? Been very shy these last couple of days. Come on.
They're tired, it's been a long day.
Here we go, one over there.
But there is
Judith,
Hello, I'm Judith Clean from the University of Worcester. I was really struck by what you said about the importance of libraries as a child, because we run a library that is joint university and public library, and it's really important for us to help people aspire to learning and to opportunities. I just wondered if you'd like to say something about our role in that arena as well, and where you see academic libraries as intersecting with the wider community.
Absolutely, and I think it is really important. In a sense, it's the equivalent of theatres and opera and orchestras trying to make sure they don't inadvertently put up barriers to young people who start to feel this is not for me. And I think an academic library that makes itself accessible and open, that tolerates and welcomes younger people, maybe doing school research projects, maybe just interested in it, can do an enormous amount, not just to help itself, but to help the whole sector, by making these places not seem strange or alien or just for others. That requires a certain tolerance on the part of the other users. And I know the direct experience of one particular library represented here, which I won't mention, where making the rules for entry more relaxed resulted in those occupying its reading rooms feeling slightly hard done by. So you have to get that balance right, and you need a tolerant user population, but I do agree. I also think that there's a really important role in teaching young people not to Google. You know, that there are other ways that they can find out the information they want faster. And because you have access to what remain paid for resources, it becomes an attractive place. So I think doing that and that sort of outreach work could be really important. It also locks the idea of the library as a place you go into people's lives before they get to college or university. And so they don't find that barrier of entry, you know, when they arrive as an undergraduate, the library is another thing to cope with. It should be part of normal life long before then.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but it's a generous offer for those who can vote now. So thank you again very much.